Right, and we're going to actually go ahead and poly paint this guy. First thing I'm going to do is grab a basic material, and I go in and I drop that diffuse down because I want a little bit of room to play with later on. I prefer to paint on a material that's doesn't have a cranked up diffuse by default, so I can go in later on and mess with that diffuse and maybe bump it up a little bit if I need to. Go ahead and put that back down to like 50 or so. And you're going to see a little bit of exploration in this particular part because I don't know exactly what I wanted to do. And I figured I'd just leave that in there just to kind of see, you could see, you know, kind of playing around, you know, especially when you're not working from a concept, you're just kind of winging it. You know, you're not going to hit everything exactly right the first time. But at least I don't. You might. But, you know, I need a little bit of time to play and kind of see what I like sometimes. So I'm starting out darker, in retrospect, darker than I needed to. But, again, I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. I knew his armor was going to be dark. So I wanted skin to contrast with that. And I knew I probably wasn't going to go the orc or troll green skin route. With that in mind, I started working forward. And again, when you start with your base color, or at least when I do, I put color in there all over the place. You know, color that makes sense, but really, you could almost throw any color on that color wheel in there as a base color, and it would still work, especially for skin tones. You don't want to make monochromatic skin. And by monochromatic, I literally mean one color. And that can be peach, red, whatever. But if it's all that same color, it's monochromatic, and nothing is really monochromatic. Sometimes you can have a monochromatic style for, you know, certain reasons, and that kind of works in certain situations. But for the most part, especially when you're doing realistic stuff or animal stuff or stuff that's based in nature, it's usually not just one color. Skin especially is a good example of you take a photograph, and maybe not a studio photograph, but go outside and take a picture of yourself or, you know, somebody, and bring it back in and really look at it, and you'll see a lot of greens, a lot of blues in the skin, you know. So be mindful of it. And if you ever look at your piece and you're thinking, wow, it looks kind of flat or boring, it's probably because your poly paints doesn't have a lot of color. And I tend to exaggerate that a little bit too much, maybe. But frankly, I'd rather err on the side of too much than not enough. So again, I don't know exactly where I'm going with this guy, but I went ahead and gave him a base coat. You know, you drag rec that veiny brush alpha and get him some colors underneath there. And as you cover that up, especially when you're experimenting, I go back in and make sure that I bring that stuff back. You know, after I get it to a certain fleshy point, I go back in and bring in some of those veins again. Because I don't want to cover up all that work. And it is all there for a reason, you know, just to kind of undulate that surface and get areas in there. And you can see as I cover them up with a fleshed color, a lot of those greens and those blues still pop through. And if you wanted to get real specific, you could actually find out exactly where the human face has green areas and magenta areas and cyan areas, because they all do. This is a little more random, but generally speaking, you keep the reds around the eyes and the nose area in the middle part of the face, and then the golden tones up to the forehead, and the cool colors down around the chin and the neck, which, again, I think I mentioned in part 1 DVD. The method I learned from Don Siegmiller, from his digital painting books. But I'm sure it's you know, it's useful for kind of pushing that skin color and face. And here I am going back in and bringing that subsurface detail back that I kind of lost because I went a little lighter with the skin than I wasn't sure how light I was going to go with the skin, and I ended up going a little bit lighter and covering it up a little bit more than I thought. In retrospect, I could have probably started with this skin lightness all over his body, really, and then done the underpainting and then painted over it. But I wasn't sure how pale I was going to go or exactly what color I was going to do. In fact, coming up, I think you're going to see me explore in a completely different, well, not completely different, but a fairly different direction. coming up, and then I end up changing my mind. But I left it in there again just to see, just so I can explain, and you could see kind of that trial and error process, just kind of feel out what you're doing when you're just kind of winging it and just kind of getting stuff in there. And when you're doing creature stuff, or especially like this gross, fleshy stuff, there's no reason you shouldn't be able to go in there and add that subsurface detail in those color areas. It just takes a couple seconds, literally. Grab, drag, rect, grab a color, and in a couple seconds worth of work, it's totally worth it. There's no reason to ever skip that step. And after I do that underpainting, I have the freehand stroke with the soft dotted brush alpha. It's not the super hard one. And in fact, sometimes I'll go into the alpha menu and blur it just a tad at this stage, and then I'll sharpen it up as I get to the more detailed areas. But at this stage, probably a soft dotted alpha, freehand, kind of brushing over the colors that I want. And occasionally I'll use the spray as well, just to spray with that brush alpha the colors and stuff, and that'll kind of undulate that color around the color that you have selected to as well. And I'm kind of exaggerating. I know I wanted to go for a pale skin, a little more of a cave dweller, but I also wanted to have that nice contrast around his mouth and his nose and his eyes. Kind of that Tim Burton look, you know, that kind of tired, evil. Kind of gives a nice feel to the character. And here I try, and I'm not going to say it was unsuccessful, because I didn't hate what it looked like. It just wasn't exactly where I wanted to go. But what I did was, I was going to go for more of a two-toned creature, kind of like like I was mentioning before, like an alligator, where you've got the armor plating and then the softer side, and they're usually a nice two-toned, where they could have a dark brownish or a dark brown, green brown on the top on their armor, and then a really nice creamy color on their underside. So I was just going to kind of check that out just a tad. And I go pretty far. And again, I'm just staying on the head while I'm testing this out. I'm not going over the whole body. I'm kind of working out my ideas on the head just real quickly. And there's no problem, with working these things out. It only this guy doesn't take all that long. And generally speaking, in Zbrush, doing a character doesn't take all that long. I think a guy like this, final product with all his armor and stuff, if there's actually a concept, we're probably only talking like maybe 4 days worth of high-res work. And then, you go down and game res it and however long that takes. But, until you shoot off your maps and get them ready for the engine or final product or whatever this guy's going to be used for. But, the actual high-res Zbrush work, maybe 4 days. It doesn't really take that long. If you do have a more complicated guy, it could take a little bit longer. Or if you're not working from a concept, this guy without a concept, with just a vague description, back and forth, rework, it could take significantly longer than 4 days. But since nobody's really art directing me on this or anything, it doesn't take that long. I'm just kind of going with it and just kind of doing what I want. But character work shouldn't be real laborious. If it is, you're probably doing it wrong. Or, you're having to go through a process which is probably a little bit painful, an approval process, which, if you're doing a lot of back and forth stuff, it's not really your fault, but, or somebody's changing their mind as to what they want. But that's another good thing about Zbrush is you can turn on a dime and do something completely different. And as long as your base work is in there, it really doesn't take that long to do another version. So even if you do have a client that changes their mind quite a bit, you can kind of move along with that, and just not get totally bogged down in rework. You can kind of rework on the fly, and yeah, it's not fun, but it's not a deal breaker like it used to be, I suppose. But here I'm exaggerating that creamy underneath, still maintaining those skin zones though. He's still got that. Right now it's pretty exaggerated, but he's still got the cool lips and chin, and then a little warmer around the nose and the eyes. which again I could go in and punch up later on. But so just work in. So I was thinking maybe in this area, maybe he'd have an aquamarine or a really dark green armored area. It's a little blue green, and then he'd have the kind of a pale cave dweller skin underneath. Here I'm adding a little bit of blues to those the dark area. And I think the reason why eventually I didn't end up going with this is just because I wanted those eyes to pop a little bit more. And it made sense to bring the dark armor along the top of his head down his neck, and then I'd probably give that same color to his chest and his shoulders, and then the rest of them would be kind of creamy, but it really wasn't working in my brain, and looking at him, it really wasn't working as well as I wanted it to, so I do run with it for a little bit longer, just to kind of see if I could salvage anything. And I do, I usually keep most of his face and his neck and stuff, but I do end up getting rid of that top dark green, because I'm losing that nice, the rings around the eyes that I wanted, kind of help that creep factor. But I do go ahead and start working some of the detail stuff just to kind of see what I could salvage and what I had to dump. And I will go ahead and turn my color eyes off and go to a flat color so I could see my cavity mask. And I turn my color eyes off, and then I do a mask by cavity here. And by messing with that profile, you can kind of fine tune your cavity. And I suggest that once you get a cavity mask, profile that you like, go ahead and save that out so you can load it again. Save yourself the trouble of doing it every time. But here I've got my cavity mask, and then I'm going to go up to Preferences, and under Edit, the Masked Object Dimming, I put that down to 1. And what that's going to do is, when you mask an object, it'll make it, it'll kind of darken it. You see it kind of paints black on, whatever surface you're on. If you take that down to 1, it's barely noticeable. So I went ahead and inverted that mask, and now I'm just kind of painting where that cavity mask is. And the cavity mask is there, but you can't really see it. And then, so on the top of the head, I went with a lighter color, and then in the creamier parts of the face, I went with the darker color on those wrinkles, the cavities, just to quickly kind of brush in what I wanted. And again, rarely would I leave that as is. I would go in and clean that up, or at least pop certain areas with it just kind of by hand. But cavity mask is great for just going in there and getting the bulk stuff out of the way. And I went ahead and grabbed a toy plastic, and I'm coloring in his eyes, the goopy area. I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do with the eyes at this point. I just put a placeholder in there. Default, evil, glowing red eyes. And I knew I wasn't going to stick with that, but just to kind of get those in there so I can kind of work around them and see that everything else is working with it, I went ahead and put it in there. And again, a lot of this exploration is due just because I was just kind of winging it. Just getting the ZBrush and having some fun, as opposed to really working out all my problems and all my issues before I jumped in. And here's where I just killed my baby. But for the better, I think, just so I could get that nice evil looking face, and that top dark green part was kind of killing it. So I went ahead and killed that, and now he's just kind of it's like Nosferatu looking, pale, dark rings, dark lips, really creepy looking. I went into the brush modes there, as you can see, and I'm going to test out a couple of these just to kind of bring some color back into his skin. So using darken, lighten, multiply, using those brush painting modes under the brush menu, with varying degrees of RGB intensity and freehand and spraying. And there's the polypaint mode. So, freehand with an alpha, just kind of brushing back in some color where I might have lost it. And here, maybe being a little heavy-handed, but I know I'm going to be making this guy a little more pale, so that's all right. I'm going to brush over this again, so introducing that color back in a big way, but it won't be this heavy-handed in the final product. And I do darken in these areas here on his head and of course around his eyes and in his mouth and stuff. But yeah, I will end up shooting an ambient occlusion map just to kind of use it, but I will have to be mindful. Like if you were to do a reptile skin in between the dark areas on its pebbled back, say you have in the cavities a light color to kind of contrast that and make it pop. You do need to be mindful when you're shooting your ambient occlusion maps that when you overlay it in your diffuse map or however you use them, go ahead and kill it in those areas because it'll kill that color and kind of make everything muddy. So definitely there's nothing wrong with ambient occlusion maps, and I'm not painting this to not have to do an ambient occlusion map. I'm still going to make one for the final version of this guy if I'd ever do a game res or whatever, but I would pick and choose where I would have it and make sure and erase it in the areas where I don't want it to kill any bright colors or anything. I went ahead and made another cavity mask. And you could save your masks out underneath the under the texture menu, I believe. I'm not looking at ZBrush right now, but in one of the videos I do, I'll go over where you could save your masks out. And of course, if you don't have UVs on this guy, it's okay. You can just give him GUV, AUV, or PUV tiles, and then make your mask, and then do the texture from mask, and then save that out. And they can always bring it back in, and then mask by alpha. You can make your texture into an alpha, and then make sure you have your alpha loaded, and then do mask by alpha, and that'll bring your mask right back in. So if you do have a nice cavity mask that you like to use that you've maybe brought in and cleaned up, you can just keep bringing it in using that method. So here, in the darker areas, I'm giving them the lighter cavities, and then in the lighter areas, I'm giving them the darker cavities. Around his eyes and his lips, you see that's the lighter cavities, and this I've already kind of, just using that base color, kind of brushed over. Exact same method as I did on his head. There's nothing new that I did on his body, just on a bigger scale. And here I am just drag recting that veiny alpha to get that subsurface detail. Now I'm brushing in the color on his veins. So, any veins that you've actually put on your guy, definitely brush those in, and then you can kind of spider some veins off of those and spider them in other areas. And then when you brush over them, you get the effect of, skin over tissue. And of course, I talked about this in part 1 when we did the head. And again, just using that soft dotted alpha and the freehand, taking a flesh tone and just kind of painting over that detail. And, if you're not in too big of a hurry, it's probably a good idea to kind of modulate that flesh tone that you're using to paint over. Because again, the more you paint over with the same color, the more monochromatic you're making it. So, in areas where he's maybe a little sweatier or he might pool a little more blood, maybe slightly tweak that flesh over color with a little more red. And then in cooler areas where it's closer, or maybe just over bone or something, you could cool it down a little bit. And, slightly turn your flesh color a little cooler. And, it'll help you in the long run. It'll help sell it in the long run. As opposed to just going over his whole body with the same flesh color, and then it's like, well, now he's monochromatic again, and I lost all that hard work. So now what I ended up going with is more of he's pale. So he's going to have dark armor, and he's generally going to be pale. I'm going to go ahead and make his, the not super leathery portions of him a little bit darker. At this stage, anyways. So it'll and he'll contrast nicely with his dark armor, I think. And he's going to look a little cave dwellerish. I do actually go in and introduce some of that darker stuff that I wanted to have back in, but I do it in a different way, and I'll talk about that when I get to that point. Again, just reintroducing some color back into him a little bit, some golden tones, and then some cooler tones. And now, this is the part I was talking about just a minute ago. I'm grabbing the spray brush with the hard dotty alpha and going in, and with a pretty high RGB intensity and a pretty heavy hand, bringing some detail in. That dotted, spotty detail. I make him kind of like a dog skin. If you've ever seen, I have a couple pugs, and when they get their hair shaved for any surgery or anything, they kind of have these dark flecks on their skin. That's kind of what I put in there, in an extreme way, anyways. And again here, I'm going to make the hands and the feet dark. And this kind of fade up into the body. And after doing this, I actually go in on other parts of his body too, like down the sides of his thighs and on his armored parts, and I actually make those a little darker, but I leave his head light. So that experiment I did at the very beginning wasn't a total waste. You know, I still kind of achieved that, but I kind of picked and choose where I wanted those dark areas as opposed to exactly what I was going to end up doing, which was the top of his head and then the leathery parts. Kind of going a little different direction, but kind of similar to what I was going to do originally. And I went ahead and cleared the mask that I had still on. That's another thing about dimming that mask is just make sure that you realize you have it on, because you're not going to be able to see it very well. Oops. Yeah, go ahead and grab the spray with the hard dot alpha. Then I go ahead and add some nice splotches on his skin. So I reintroduce back in the darker areas of his armor and stuff, but just in a kind of a different way that works a little bit better for what I wanted to try and achieve. And in here, I go into the material and I bump up the diffuse. I play the specular a little bit and then go down to the high dynamic range and play with that just a tad. And I get it in a nice mid-range of what I want to work with. And I go ahead and add some more goopy parts on him. Those places where he's a little more wet. Mouth, ears. Give him some membranes underneath his those little oxygen membranes that he has. Goop those up. And in this little portion right here, remember I said I didn't want him to have pebbly skin? Well, I actually go in and make his skin a little pebbly, just to kind of contrast a little bit more, because I think I went a little heavy on the leather on the other portions of his skin. So I do go in and kind of make his heavier leather areas a little more pebbly. If I did have the time, I would probably go in and exaggerate the leatheriness of it as opposed to just adding pebbles. But this was a fast and easy fix for me. And You know, again, it's not ideal, but I do go ahead and rethink about where I want him heavier. And these are basically the areas where I'm going to have him darkest. So we are going to have dark skin and light skin areas of him. But I'm going in and rethinking about where I want to do that. And again, I didn't do any of this beforehand, so you know you are seeing a lot of that trial and error. It's not all perfectly worked out in beforehand, but you know, that's real life. And I'm going in and changing those brush profiles and those different brushes just to kind of have it a little more rounded as opposed to just a flat brush. I go in and pop these areas out. And again, this is a quick fix. It's probably not the ideal fix that I would have wanted to do, but just real quickly go in there and change up those surface properties just a little bit. So that's another area of contrast on them. You know, it's all about the contrast. You know, these areas need to contrast a little bit more than they were, and so this is just an easy way to do it. And you know, I did just kind of drop the pebbles on there, and I don't do it all that much, but you do want to kind of go in, and if you have the time, go and kind of work those pebbles back into the skin. You know, put those skin lines around them so they kind of get brought back into his character. I do it a little bit here, but I don't go crazy because I know realistically, for what I'm going to be using this guy for, and for marketing purposes and stuff, and for this DVD, you know, you got to kind of pick and choose your battles, and I didn't want to spend a lot of time on this part. But ideally, when you go in and pebbleize skin, you want to kind of work it back into the character. And so when I do go back in, what I'm doing here is I went ahead and dragged my character on the canvas, and then I dropped him, and then I dragged out another version, shows back, all on the same canvas, and then I go to Texture, Grab Doc, and I export that as a PSD. I'm going to take this into Photoshop really quickly, and just kind of play with the direction I want to go with this guy. So I'm going to take this that dropped canvas into Photoshop to kind of play around with what I wanted to achieve, as opposed to do it in Zbrush, which it's fast to do it in Zbrush, but it's also a little bit faster just to go into Photoshop and use some of their tools to kind of do it really quickly. So what I did was made a new layer with a color dodge, and I'm going to introduce some warmer colors into his unarmored areas, and then I'm going to contrast that with some cool tones in his armored areas. So it's going to be like a cream and purple kind of thing. So I'm doing that on a color dodge layer just to introduce those colors, and then eventually I'll flatten that and then just use the dodge and burn tools with the protect tone on when we get there. And you could actually do this with ZapLink. There'll be a ZapLink demonstration, and you can actually take a ZapLink of your character and then do exactly what I'm doing here, and then have it applied directly to your character. But just for what I'm doing here, I'm just kind of playing. And really, I wasn't really interested in using ZapLink for this. I'll just end up doing it in ZBrush. It just takes a couple minutes, but it's one option if you need to. And here I am with the dodge and burn stuff, is dodging him a little bit. And again, this isn't perfect or beautiful. I'm just trying to get an idea real quickly of the direction I want to head with this guy. Again, I'm exaggerating between the dark purple and the creamy. And if I was really smart, I'd probably be doing this with armor on, so I can make sure that these areas are playing nice with his armor and it's working. But I trust it to work out. As we're playing with that in Photoshop for a little bit, I'll go back into ZBrush and kind of do what I just did, and using some poly paint modes. This one's probably multiplying that dark purple color into the areas where I kind of put them in the Photoshop file. And you know, while you're doing this, if you have a specific light rig that you're doing this for, this one's kind of obviously neutral lighting. But you know, go in and change your lighting and make sure it works on the conditions that you're going to be doing for your final product. Or even while you're sculpting, you know, move that light around and make sure you're not missing anything. Again, introducing some of those warmer colors. And multiplying back in some purples. And this is just with a free hand with that softer dotted brush alpha. To kind of, you know, retain some of that texture. And it looks like I got a cavity mask on this guy with that that dimming turned down. And again, this whole process doesn't take all that long, and that's the great thing about poly painting is, and you don't even really have to set it up for poly painting. As long as you have polygons, you can poly paint. Don't need to worry about texture maps or UVs or anything. You can do all that later. Just get in there and, you know, get it done super fast. And you know, this guy's at 10 million polygons, so I'm getting plenty of detail, especially like, you know, more detail than a 2048 could handle. So that's perfectly fine. And I'm doing it while I capture, you know, and I think I'm on a Vista 64-bit machine with 8 gig of RAM, and I'm capturing and have a couple other programs open, so, and it can handle it just fine is my point. So problemo. And here I am again messing around with the material settings. High dynamic range, the ambient, and the diffuse. Kind of punch him up to that visual target I had set in Photoshop real quickly. Now I've got my free hand with that alpha and just kind of bring it back in some of those oranges that I had color dodged. And like I said, you could have used Zap Link and just plopped it right back onto him, but this is just as, you know, this is fast and easy to do and a little bit more control, and I don't mind doing it. So, but you know, whatever makes you happier, whatever you're more comfortable with. And just getting some more color back into this guy.